Welcome to Solution Focused Future. I'm Joe George. Today, we're talking with Jason Pascoe out of Australia. And Jason, how do you like to be introduced?
I'd love people to know that we're really passionate about helping individuals, teams, and leaders of teams who feel completely stuck. Sometimes they don't know where to start, work out what to do next so they can create meaningful change faster.
Excellent. And why solution-focused brief therapy?
It was never, ever pitched to me as therapy. It was so. Look, it's been a pretty long journey in some ways, so I'll be as succinct as I can be. My background is education. I'm a third-generation teacher. Mum and Dad were both high school teachers. Mum's mum was a primary school teacher, and I was that kid that when they got home, they said, "We've put up with kids like you all day, don't." So I kind of vowed never, ever to be a teacher. So I avoided it as long as possible. My undergrad stuff is in human physiology, and then I went and studied, everyone knows this term after the last few years, but I studied epidemiology and population medicine after that. Then I couldn't avoid teaching any longer, and I trained to be a teacher and ended up running a faculty in a high school. Got to this point in my career where my sister, who's a psychologist, said, "I've found your dream job." And that got me curious. And I ended up leaving education. We left Newcastle, Australia, where we lived, and I was managing mental health promotion, prevention, early intervention and pathways to care across 53 secondary schools, 120,000 square kilometres, me in a car. That was it. That's all the resources we had. And I was working with teams in schools around youth mental health and wellbeing. I was part of the child and adolescent mental health team. And what I realised was that I had no line management responsibility in any of those conversations anymore, and I was in a completely different context. So I was coming in with my car and just me to try and help educators think differently about mental health and wellbeing. And some conversations went better than others. But I didn't understand why they did or what I could do differently to make them even better. And it was 2011 when I met Dr. Mark McCurgo and his wife, Jenny Clark. They came out to Australia, and I was doing a masterclass in coaching. I'd been trained as an executive coach at that stage. And as Mark unpacked the solution-focused conversation, these light bulbs just started going on around what worked in the conversations I was having with these teams. So I never, ever looked at solution-focused brief therapy. My introduction was through coaching, and because I was working with teams and organisations, it was never kind of a one-on-one conversation. It was always organisational.
When you get to your trainings, do you start with best hopes? Do you start on building on strengths? Do you start on, like, what's your rationale and starting point?
Okay. I start with the introduction. Just like you said, how do I want to be introduced? Usually I'll stand at the front of the room and I'll break people into groups, and I will start with, what are your best hopes from attending this training? And I'll get them to write that down. Then I'll get them to share it with someone, and I'll say, what difference will that make? And then they'll share that. And there's no introduction until about 10 minutes in, and we've started with these conversations and people are into it. And then I say, okay, let's break into groups. You get to construct the invitation. So they break into groups, and I'll say, we're going to take 5 questions. You've got 3 minutes in your groups. What do you want to know about the person standing up the front? Or what would you like to know about what you're in for the next 2 days? And they construct the agenda and they construct the invitation. And that's kind of the introduction of, these are the types of conversations that we are going to have for the rest of the 2 days.
Do you use solution-focused thinking in your own life?
Yes. I'd say I've become more optimistic. I've probably learnt to catch my pessimistic thinking more quickly. So yeah, I do. I don't think I do overtly, but I definitely am more future oriented in my thinking than I was beforehand.
A lot of people are family systems therapists, or but they take it from a therapeutic approach in conversation in one-on-one, and then they extrapolate outward to groups. You're the first person I've encountered that you started with groups and then you hone it down to individuals. What are the three most important things you think people should master as they learn to use solution focused thinking?
Listening for what's wanted and helping the person, the group, or the team build a description of that and the difference that that will make in their futures. Getting them to listen to the conversations their teams are having and think about, so if they're stuck in talking about problems, challenges or issues, what is it they might want instead of that? And it could be asking them directly. It could be just injecting what I think or I've heard into the conversation. And looking at the response that you get from that. So a classic example I'll give is I talk a lot about a class that I used to have called 8J. And if people would come and talk to me about 8J, I'd learnt the organisational jargon to be able to navigate conversations easily and take not much accountability. So I'd say, hey, I want 8J to be more engaged. I think the beauty of solution-focused conversations is we don't go with those big words that can be so abstract that in the interaction we don't know what they mean. Because here's what I mean when I use the word engaged, and here's what you mean, and there could be that much overlap. And you walk past my classroom and you see me doing something over here, and you're going, really? And the beauty of describing the future in as much detail as we would normally describe the past or the present means that I can't get away with that sort of jargon in my practice. I actually have to think about, so Joe, if you walk past my classroom next Tuesday as I was teaching 8J, I think you would notice these things about them if they were more engaged. Supposing they were more engaged, what might 8J notice about me as their teacher? And all of a sudden we're into that relational, interactional detail where there is so much richness and meaning, and in that conversation, setting up the ideas of what I could walk out of and change very, very quickly.
Listening for what's wanted, and then building forward. Is there a third component tied that you really think needs to be mastered, or does it really come down to those two?
I think it's also about resourcefulness. So not only me listening for the strengths, the skills, the qualities, and even the strategies that work in someone else's story and helping identify those, but if I can help people identify those for themselves and talk about their strengths, skills, and qualities that they bring rather than me point them out, I think that's a great thing, to point them out and notice them. But if they can start noticing them and pointing them out, that brings so much more to that journey forward.
How do you feel having been an educator has influenced your implementation of solution focused practice?
I think there are some benefits and I think there are some challenges. Because classically, as an educator, you've got a curriculum to follow and you've got outcomes that must be achieved, and you learn to think like that. Whereas to let go of that, and I think that was the move out of education into health, where there was no line management responsibility in those conversations. So you had to work out what worked and do more of what worked, and then let people have the autonomy to go off and do whatever it is they were going to do after you spoke with them. So there was some good training in 4 or 5 years of doing that. So the other side of that is knowing about group dynamics, noticing what's going on, not with the main event in the room, being able to position yourself in different parts of the room when you're facilitating and running training. So there's the trusting that people will get to where they need to go, which is that, that solution-focused approach here. But then there's also the facilitation skills that you learn as a teacher, and being able to read 30, 40, 50, sometimes, well, you can't read 200 people in a room, but I've worked with 200 people in a room, for 4 hours or with this sort of stuff, and people are having these sort of aha moments around the room, and it's just magical to do that. And I think bringing the two together has been a huge advantage.
What fields beyond counseling and schools do you feel best align with solution-focused practice?
Look, here's the thing: when you run a business, classically you're supposed to have an avatar that you kind of market to, and you do, and yet this is so useful in so many situations that I don't think that I haven't found a place where it's not. Even if it's just a quick conversation, or it's the classic listening with ears type frame that you might do. You can do that at the checkout in the supermarket. That changes the "how are you today, sir?" and that sort of conversation. You can, and yet I work with executive teams building strategy. What are your best hopes for the organization? And finding common ground in that, and getting them to listen for what's wanted in each other's best hopes, and then building the next layer. So I call it this collective best hopes that you build together, and then starting to think about, so what would need to be in place to have any chance of strategic success, and then using solution-focused conversation to help them move forward. And I've done that with teams over 4 and 5 years. And thankfully it seems to be useful, because they keep asking me to come back and keep doing it.
Were there ever any moments where solution-focused practice didn't seem to be working for you?
Only if I tried to take control of it and drive people to a certain predetermined, in my mind or in the sponsor's mind's place. And that was only very, very early on in relation to that. If there are some must-dos and must-achieves, I've learned that they need to come from the sponsor, either before or early on.
And how much flexibility do you have in building collective best hope instead of the sponsor best hope?
That's always part of the initial conversation. So what is it you want? What would be different after the training? What would be different 6 months after the training? And we start to get some detail into those conversations. So, and then what is it that they need to hear from you about this before I walk into the room? Let me put it this way. I was speaking at the Australia-New Zealand Solution-Focused Brief Therapy Conference 2017, and we were talking about building strategy using solution-focused conversations. And if I use the language of Mark and Paul in their book, The Solutions Focus, they talk about the platform building, which is best hopes, what difference will that make, and then having that sort of destination or direction for the conversation. And one of the people in the audience said, sometimes you get your platform given to you in an organization. You've got your KPIs, you've got the vision or the mission of the organization, and sometimes you just get that platform given to you for your department. And as long as you can acknowledge that sometimes that happens in organizations, then you can build from there.
But if you had to come up with an advertising campaign for solution-focused practice, what would your slogan be?
It is our slogan: meaningful change faster.
Yeah, that was fast. Now, with Enactive Solutions, I was looking at your site, and it talks about obviously the solution-focused approach, but then it also gets a lot into host leading. But it's not clearly. I didn't walk away with a clear understanding what host leading was. What is host leading?
Okay, so Like I said, Dr. Mark McCurgo introduced me to the solution-focused approach. And it was 2011, Sydney, Chinatown. I was totally blown away by what I'd learned in day one. And Mark and Jenny and I, with another colleague, were sitting at dinner. And Mark just kind of dropped into the conversation, as he tends to do. What do you think about host leadership? And it was instantly meaningful for me, because not only had I worked in schools and organisations and for health, I'd also worked for the National Mental Health Initiative. We called it Mind Matters here, which was, I ended up working with across 900 schools, and I was the state coordinator for that approach. And what it gave me the opportunity to do was spend a year working with the Yamana Aboriginal Men's Group up in a place called Tamworth here. And we were looking at resilience-based projects for kids, for our First Nations kids in schools. And the Department of Education asked me to come and do that, and said, would you come and speak at the youth leadership camp? And I said, what good is it another white man standing up there, talking to First Nations kids about this stuff? Who else needs to be involved? And I met the men's group, and we mentored them through the development and design of a program that ended up being called Feeling Deadly, Not Shame. And that sent me on a trajectory of stepping into and out of different cultures, and that journey that when Mark mentioned this over dinner, it was like I had a language for what we'd been doing for the last year. And we just talk about leading as a host, not a hero or a servant. So rather than stepping forward all the time and having to be the one that rescues people like the hero, or stepping back and taking on sometimes too much as the servant leader, the host operates above that continuum. And the fundamental question in leading is, do I need to step forward or step back next? And then of the 6 roles that Mark and Helen identify in the book, if I'm going to step forward or step back, do I step back as the initiator, someone who listens for what's being called for and then steps forward just with a small step? Or the inviter, who are my guests in this next thing? And what's in it for them? What do they bring to this next thing, whatever that is? And what is it we're hoping to achieve together? So how do I invite people well? And once they're coming to something, what's the space, the physical space, the interactional space, and the head space we need to be able to pull this off? And then the gatekeeper. So what will be the boundaries of that container, and how will we negotiate those together? And then the connector. How does a leader connect ideas, connect people, and create connections across an organisation? And then as a leader, when do you need to just co-participate and let others step forward and take the lead? So there's 6 roles, 4 positions. And Mike Brent from Ashridge Business School just presented on using host leadership as a metaphor for coaching.
Like 6 things as you're doing a conversation when you aren't used to doing any of them. Like, how do you guide them to do it without thinking about it too much?
It's not how do you do this? It's more, this. You know how to host, whether it was a birthday party for one of your kids, or you know how to be hosted because you've been to a dinner party. But let's think more strategically and organisationally about that. And in every story of leadership, the roles emerge, the 4 positions of host leading emerge. And as leaders start to weave that into their language, and teams start to weave that into their language, they very quickly can know, okay, I know what I've got to do next. I know what's being called for, but I need some people to come with me. What's the invitation? And they start to use the language of the roles in what they already do. So therefore, they become more intentional about their leadership. They get clearer on what to do next relatively quickly. and they start to hear that language across the organization so others know what's coming and what they can do next.
You've done these interviews and you've talked to different people. I know you've watched a lot of interviews. What am I missing? What else would you like to add?
What I like about what we've covered and what keeps sort of just buzzing around for me is that the solution focused approach is phenomenally flexible and stretches not only the practitioners but stretches the people that we work with and that we use it with. And look, my encouragement is if you're working one-on-one but you're part of a team in an organization or even part of an organization, you can take everything you know here and start to stretch the team and start to stretch the leadership, and you can stretch horizontally or you can stretch vertically in terms of positional power and things. It works in so many different ways and places, and I'm not talking about using it covertly either to manipulate. I'm just saying you use it, try it out in a meeting, use some resource type talk in a meeting. You've ever been in a meeting where people are around the table and someone goes, look, this is what we need to do next, and someone goes, that'll never work. Or they go, I've been here 15 years. We tried that 10 years ago, didn't work then, won't work now. And all the ideas just keep getting pushed off the table. But if you can be a little bit curious and say, so it sounds to me your idea was about this. Yeah, that's what it was about. And so, Joe, when you were saying that sounds a bit similar. Yeah. And all of a sudden, two people that were disagreeing about ideas in a meeting, you've listened for some common ground and you've just fed that back in. And then off the common ground, so well, I'm curious, when have we been even a little bit close to that? Whoever comes across this interview somewhere in cyberspace, if you don't even know what we're talking about, look into solution-focused brief therapy, solution-focused approaches in organizations. If you do know about it and you're just hearing about it from a different angle, you've never applied it, my encouragement is pick a piece of what you do one-to-one and see the ripples that has in a team meeting or with a group or, in a performance review conversation, that sort of space. And just try this stuff out in another context.
Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate your thoughts, your ideas, and your support. And hopefully our paths will cross again in the future.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you for your questions.